Hello there, and welcome to our first week of events here at Rbmk. Hope you're so welcome. Thank you so much for coming this afternoon. I'll be taking us as we explore purpose and what it means, or what is the meaning of life here today. My name's Josh, and I'll be your host today. And we'll be thinking about the topic of climate change and what it means, or is it too late to save the world? We hope you enjoy, and please do send and submit your questions to the Slido. The link will be on the screen during the talk, and at the end of the talk, we'll have a chance for question and response, which will be great. So I'm going to invite our speaker this afternoon, who is Niv Lobo. He's a chaplain at the university and recently spoke at our carol service. So please do give him a round of applause as he comes up. Great.
Brilliant. Well, it's such a delight. I'm not meant to go any nearer the speakers than that. Okay. It's such a delight to be with you this lunchtime. Thank you so much for joining us all this week at these purpose events. There can be an opportunity for you to engage with some of the big questions we're asking, and we would love to know the questions you have. So do use the Slido stuff, which will come up on the screen, and after I'm done, there'll be a chance for Q&A. Please feel free to ask any question. No question too hostile, no question too simple, and I'll do the best I can. Recently, I was reading a book by a trauma specialist, and he talked about the child of a couple he knew. And this child grew up going to school in downtown New York, very close to the Twin Towers. And on 9/11, this child saw some awful things, terribly scarring things. And so the trauma specialist, a doctor called Bessel van der Kolk, was obviously really invested in this child and went to see him. And when he went to see the child a few weeks in, the child had done a drawing which might come up behind us. And like all children's drawings, you can just about notice what's going on. You can see some towers and some smoke and actually even a plane up there. But what Bessel van der Kolk noticed was a black circle down at the bottom of one of the towers. And he asked the child, "What's that?" And the child said, "That's a trampoline, so the next time they can all jump to safety." Next time. And Bessel van der Kolk says that ability to think of the future differently, in other words, to hope, is a key part of how humanity can cope with disaster. And it's what makes our question this lunchtime so pressing. Is it too late to save the world? What if there won't be a next time? What if the way the humanity is treating the environment means that in some sense it really is too late? Recently there was a survey of 10,000 16 to 25-year-olds in your age category over 10 different countries. And this is what they found. 59% of them were extremely worried. Over 50% felt sad, anxious, angry, powerless, helpless, and guilty. Over 45% said that climate change negatively affected their daily life and functioning. I wonder how you would have responded to that survey. I wonder how you respond to what's going on with the environment. Do you find yourself kind of numb because this is an issue that's just too big for anyone to sort on their own? Do you find yourself hoping that the problem would just go away? Or do you find yourself angry, really angry at what's been done to the planet? During the pandemic, when we stopped doing pretty much everything that was normal, thousands were still drawn to the streets to protest and demand change from our leaders. And that's because the scale of what we're talking about sounds world-destroying. The predictions that scientists are making pose an existential threat to how we currently live. The consequences for those in the global south would be dire. Loss of homes, livelihoods, lives. No wonder when people talk about this subject, they say that it's apocalyptic. I wonder if you heard people say that. And I actually agree. This situation is apocalyptic. But if you'll forgive me being a bit of a pedant, not the way that most people mean. See, a lot of people use the word apocalyptic to mean scary, end-of-the-world stuff. That's not actually what the word means. There's another word for that. I can tell you that later. The word apocalyptic, though, means an unveiling, a revealing, an uncovering. And so the climate crisis is apocalyptic because it is so revealing of so many different things. It's revealing about the truth of our world. That's one of the things that it reveals. as permanent damage appears to be done to our environment, there's a powerful sense of loss. We see a dazzling array of wildlife driven to extinction. Places where human beings used to thrive, no longer habitable. And as we see that loss, there's a deep intuition that the world is precious, that it has value, that this loss is a problem, and that how we treat the world matters. So let me ask you, where does that sense of value come from? One of my favorite novelists is a woman called Marilyn Robinson, and in one of her non-fiction essays, she said this: "Say that we are a puff of warm breath in a very cold universe. By this kind of reckoning, we are either immeasurably insignificant, or we are incalculably precious and interesting. I tend towards the second view. Scarcity is said to create value, after all. Of course, value is a meaningful concept only where there is relationship, someone to do the valuing. What makes the world valuable? What makes its biodiversity beautiful and worth protecting? Value is meaningful only where there's someone to do the valuing. And you may say, okay, Niv, that's easy. Us. We're the ones who can do the valuing. We find it valuable, therefore it is. But actually, that's a fairly problematic line of reasoning. Because who's us? There are so many people in the world who don't agree about how we should treat the environment. So many of us see our planet as a resource to plunder rather than something to cherish. So what happens when we disagree on what the value of the world should be? This is an issue, because all of us will have different arguments, come from different perspectives. So how do we adjudicate between those different perspectives? By what value do we judge the evaluations we ourselves make? If the value of the world only exists in human thinking, then that means that it's radically up for grabs. And whatever else that is, it is not a secure foundation for responsible action. We need a different kind of value, one that doesn't just depend on us. Because the attitude that says that the world is just for us and we can deal with it any way we like is surely how we got here. Surely that is part of the problem. And so to take the injustice of the climate crisis seriously, we need a meaning bigger than the ones we invent. We need a value beyond any of our evaluations. And we need more than the threadbare definitions of nature as meaningless until we got there. That's why it's good news that there is someone to do the valuing, the creator of everything, who made it with meaning and intent. And that's why it's worth taking seriously. It's why your intuition that you should protect the world is a right one. That's why life matters, human and non-human life. The climate crisis reveals the truth about our world, that we need a meaning bigger than any we can invent. And we need a bigger one than any one person or culture or generation can come up with on their own. The climate crisis also reveals, however, the truth about us and what we're capable of. Stephen Hawking, the late great Stephen Hawking, once said this: "The human race is just a chemical scum on a moderate-sized planet." Try putting that in a Valentine's Day card. Probably won't go very well. Is that true? Now, of course, we are very small. That's a good point. But are we just a chemical scum? The climate crisis challenges that because it shows that we have a disproportionate impact on the world we inhabit. Actually, the way human beings act can have huge consequences for literally everything else around us. And you know, that's actually what the Bible has said from the beginning, that there's a vital relationship between how we live and the earth we live on. And if we didn't believe that before, we have to believe it now. Here's a quote you might have seen in discussions like this, an environmental lawyer called James Speth, and he's said to have come to this realization: "I used to think the top environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. I thought that with 30 years of good science, we could address these problems, but I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy, and to deal with those we need a spiritual and cultural transformation. And we scientists don't know how to do that." And maybe you're here as a rare art student at Southampton. You're going, yeah, scientists don't have all the answers. But that's not quite the point he's making. None of us have all the answers. The climate crisis confronts us with the stubborn reality that human selfishness, greed, and apathy are part of the problem. This disaster we're looking at all stems from the way that we are able to privilege ourselves over anyone and anything else, even in the face of looming disaster. And you know, not even clear warnings are enough. We've had decades worth of those. Have any of you seen the amazing TV show Chernobyl? Any of you seen it? It's absolutely stunning. And all the way through it, the running question is, how does an Rbmk reactor core explode? That's what happened in the Chernobyl disaster in the 80s. And no one has an answer. It just shouldn't have happened. It's unexplainable. Except through this series, you follow a trail of corruption and lies, and you see how key structural flaws were hidden in the name of saving costs. And so the protagonist, the real-life figure Valery Legasov, says this in his deposition. When the truth offends, we lie and lie until we can no longer remember it is even there. But it is still there. Every lie we tell incurs a debt to the truth. Sooner or later, that debt is paid. That is how an Rbmk reactor core explodes. Lies. Disasters with global consequences are unleashed when we insulate ourselves against the truth. And the climate crisis tells us that there are meaningful and irresistible consequences to the way that we live. Sooner or later, the debt is paid. Our lies, our exploitation will all catch up with us in the end. In the 20th century, it was possible to laugh at street preachers as they found you in the street and said, "The end is nigh, change your ways." But now in the 21st century, none of us are laughing as street protesters say exactly the same thing. The climate crisis reveals our need to change our ways before it's too late. Those are some of the things the climate crisis reveals. And I want to suggest it also reveals what the Christian faith has to offer. Because actually, we don't believe that it's too late to save the world. We don't believe that things are hopeless. And in fact, the Christian Union put on a week of events like Purpose because they would love everyone at this university to engage with that claim and see if it has anything to offer them. But, you know, I can't just talk about the hope that Christians have to offer without also acknowledging that the way that some Christians have responded to that hope has been double-edged, to say the least. How Christian behavior has, at times, been part of the problem. There are two things I can't ignore, one of them from the very beginning of the Christian account and one from the end. Here's the one from the beginning. So, the Bible says that human beings are made with unique dignity and made in God's image, and we read this in Genesis chapter 1. God says, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over all the livestock and wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." Humanity made in God's image, given a dignity like nothing else on earth, and from that has flowed a vision of humanity privileged over everything else, licensed to exploit everything else. It's not difficult to draw a line between that and Descartes' famous statement that we should pursue mastery and possession of nature. It's what he said, we could become masters and possessors. And so some have seen Christianity as alienating us from the rest of the world, encouraging us to see it as collateral. One issue from the beginning. Here's another from the end. And this is an example from Jesus speaking about the end of the world. And actually, if you wanted to follow along, you could find it for yourself in one of these accounts of Jesus' life on your table, chapter 13. And it's also up on the screen. Jesus says, "But in those days, following that distress, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from the sky, and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. At that time, people will see the Son of Man," which is Jesus' favorite name for himself, "coming in clouds with great power and glory." And if you're looking for the page number for that, probably should have said, I pinned it down earlier, it's page 70. Now, the thing that's so curious there is that, to give you the context, Jesus is talking about the end of a world. In this chapter, he's talking about the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem and what that will mean for Judaism at the time. But as you can see, he also starts talking about the end of the world. Starts talking about what that will look like when he returns. And so many Christians have heard that and thought, well, look, okay, if Jesus is going to come and there's going to be all of this cosmic transformation, why bother doing anything with it now? I've actually had Christians say to me, it's all going to burn, isn't it? why does it matter how we treat it? I don't want to speak ill of my fellow believers, but I think that both of those are actually serious errors worth confronting. Descartes is moving us further away from the Bible, not towards it, when he tells us to be masters and possessors of nature. Because it's true that God creates us to rule, but that ruling has to be done in his image. And if the way we rule the world doesn't reflect what God himself is like, then we're not doing it right. Then it isn't acceptable. And look through the Bible and you will find so many moments of God's delight in his creation. He loves the world he's made. So at the end of this wonderful ancient poem called Job, you find God talking about bits of nature and creation that human beings have never understood, have never successfully tamed. And he says, those bring me glory. Jesus tells us to look at birds, to look at flowers, because otherwise we will not truly understand what it looks like for God to care for us. Let me read you another little moment from the Bible. This is from a book called Isaiah. He was writing 700 years before Jesus, and the language he's using is feeding into what Jesus said in Mark 13. The earth dries up and withers. The world languishes and withers. The heavens languish with the earth. The earth is defiled by its people. They have disobeyed the laws, violated the statutes, and broken the everlasting covenant. Therefore a curse consumes the earth. Its people must bear their guilt. Therefore earth's inhabitants are burned up and very few are left. It's a picture of a nightmare, and a nightmare caused by human behavior, caused precisely by our failure to image God in how we treat the world, in how we treat one another, and in how we treat him, our maker. It's a crisis which is the reason why our world needs saving. And you might know if you've spoken to Christians, we're very fond of that word, saving or saved. We love to talk about God saving because that's what he's in the business of doing. And you'll see it if you keep opening up these Gospels of Mark. Saving is what Jesus is all about when he says he's come to die and rise again. It's what's been happening as people over the centuries since, all over the world, have been saying yes to him. And we believe it's something he will do fully and finally when he returns. And the reason why that's worth taking seriously is that it gets to the heart of the issue. And I use that word advisedly. The climate crisis shows us that it's human selfishness, greed, and apathy that are the problem. And not only does that mean that it's a problem, it also means that our attempts to help might be part of the problem. How do we know that we're not just pursuing our own selfish gain in the way we talk about this? Saving is the thing we need, but not just superficial quick fixes. We need it at our heart level. And that's exactly what Jesus has come to bring. That's why it's not too late for our world to be saved. Because it's not too late for us to be saved. See, the climate crisis we're starting to see is the fallout and wreckage from a spiritual crisis we spend our lives trying not to see. The crisis that comes when we center ourselves, no matter what that means for other people, what that means for our world, and what that means for the God who made us and actually does belong at the center. That's why we're crying out for people to change their ways. Something must be done. And Jesus says he's come to do that thing because he says he will choose to die, to face the consequences of our wrongdoing so that we can be forgiven. And then rise again to show that there is nothing so broken that he cannot restore it. He cannot make it new. So should we leave it all to him? Just let him get on with it and keep trashing the world? Well, he will restore all things. But if you keep reading in Mark 13, what Jesus says is keep watch. Keep watch. He calls us to live transformed lives in the light of the forgiveness we've received. And of course, if we don't, then you have to ask whether we've really received it. The logic that says God can bring good out of evil, so let's do evil, it's not Christian logic. There's literally a verse in the Bible to say that. Shall we go on sinning so that grace may increase? By no means. That's not how we're called to live. The forgiveness Jesus offers is not a ticket to a disembodied heaven that means we can trash what's left behind. It's a summons to a world made new, this world. It's not like the ending of a famous recent film that I won't name because I don't want to spoil it, where the earth is destroyed and you see a pod of billionaires escaping and then thousands of years later, returning to repopulate the earth. That is not what Jesus is offering. He's calling each one of us to be transformed, to be renewed in the image of the God who made us and loves the world that he made. So no, it's not too late to save the world. That's something Jesus promises to do. And if we discover that for ourselves, we discover that we're free from the anxiety that this topic brings, but not in a way that feeds our apathy, in a way that fuels our action. I love the declaration Martin Luther King Jr. made, the crisis of the civil rights movement. He said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." Does it? Science can't see any moral universes. All it can see is the heat death of everything. But Martin Luther King knew Jesus' promises and took them seriously, knew that Jesus had promised ultimate reconciliation, and so knew it was worth striving for then. And what was true when it comes to racial reconciliation is true also for how we treat the planet we have been given to live on. What I've been saying is only the beginning. There's so much that still needs to be done. So much practical change for us to talk about how we live, how we act, where we spend our money, all that sort of thing. But imagine doing the things that need to be done, not out of a blind panic, but with a deep purpose. Imagine doing it with a bigger story of reality, a true story of reality that can guide your intuitions about how precious the world is and steer them towards a hopeful future. And that begins with saying yes to Jesus, with discovering what Martin Luther King did, that his promises are worth believing, and they actually enable us to change the world we live in now. So just as I close, though, why take that seriously? Well, don't take my word for it. Why not use this week to weigh the world-changing impact of Jesus, to see for yourself the difference he's made in history? And by the way, it is history. No serious historian denies his existence. They can't. There's too much evidence. And he has changed our world in a way no one else has. We literally measure history around his life. And here's all he had to work with. This is what history tells us. He only had 3 years in the public eye. He didn't have that many followers, 12 among his close friends, most of whom were haphazard and incompetent, one of whom betrayed him. He wasn't moving about with movers and shakers in a university town, but in the backwaters of the Galilean countrysides, where there were just peasants and nobody of much importance. He had no money to spend. He had no armies to fight for him. And at the end of that 3 years, the grand finale, a shameful public execution. History tells us that is all Jesus had to work with. And yet with that and nothing else, he's transformed our world beyond recognition. And in fact, will keep his promise to transform it again beyond all recognition. Thank you so much for listening to me. Our invitation this week is that you can dig into the claim of Jesus for yourself and see the difference it makes, see the purpose it might give. Why don't we take a minute, 30 seconds around our tables, have a chat, maybe come up with a question, maybe send it in to the Slido, and then Josh will bring us back up for Q&A. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for that question. How do we find joy in the present when we see the devastating impact? Brilliant question. I am going to tell you about how we find joy, but is it all right if I say at first that joy is not the only and best response to the way the way things are in our world now? We'll talk a lot about this tomorrow lunchtime as well. But if there's a serious problem, then finding joy can't be our only desire. We also need to acknowledge that that problem is there and also find ways of dealing with it. I think that's a really important thing for us to grasp. And yet, at the same time, one of the things an early Christian called Paul says is that his way through life is that he's sorrowful, yet always rejoicing. He's able to be both lamenting the world and the things that are wrong with it, and deeply joyful because of what he knows God is committed to doing in it. And I think, although I don't want to over-speculate what it would look like for you, but I think what that might mean is doing your degree, seeing that things are being damaged, seeing that things are being lost, but being able to whisper to yourself, this is not the end of the story. This is not how God will leave his world. I want to be part of the solution, not part of the problem, because I know where he wants to take things. I know the renewal he wants to bring to our cosmos. And I think that does make a difference. And of course, even when you think to yourself, but this feels so impossible to imagine, if you know Jesus who rose from the dead, then you know the one who's able to do that which is impossible to imagine, and to bring the freedom, to bring the hope we're talking about.
Thank you so much. We'll go on to our next question, which is, but if God cares for the world so much, why is climate change so bad? Why didn't God just stop it?
Brilliant question. Why doesn't God just stop climate change? Why doesn't he intervene? And I guess what we're saying is that Jesus is committing to intervene, just not yet. That part of him fixing everything is the judgment, the restitution, the putting right that all of us are craving, but not yet. Why not yet? A couple of reasons. One is that God has created us with that dignity of living in a way that shapes everything else. That is an incredible privilege, but also an amazing responsibility. And if God were to come in and blast away the way we've lived, that would not be him honoring the responsibility he's given us. That would be him kind of blotting it out. And the thing you'll find about God is he never saves people in a way that destroys what he made them to be. His grace, his saving action, actually renews nature, perfects it, brings it to a beautiful completion. So what we'd be asking for, if we asked God to step in every time human beings were going wrong, would be for him to stop treating us like human beings. And that's just not what God's like. One of the wonderful things is you discover he made us in his image to know him and love him and be known by him and be loved by him. He didn't make us as sock puppets to have a kind of weird, impersonal relationship with. Where things go wrong, he just steps in and makes us do what we should. No, he doesn't compel us like that. He draws us to live in a different way. That may raise many more questions, but I think it's an important part of the answer. Second part of the answer, because God is not doing that yet, because that day of putting right and judgment is not yet, that's also because he wants us to be on the right side of it when it comes, which is why we put on a week like this, to explore what it would mean for us if God is committed to right and putting things wrong. What would that mean if we have been part of the problem? It means that we need to be put right too. It means that we need to discover forgiveness. It means that reconciliation is not just something that has to happen outside us to other people, but even for us. And if you read the book Life of Pi, Life of Pi, good book. I like that book. He grows up in a zoo in India, and there's an exhibit in the zoo called The Most Dangerous Animal in the Zoo. What's it going to be? Lions, tigers, bears? You pull the curtains, and it's a mirror. You are the most dangerous animal in the zoo. And I think all of us need to have an individual awakening to that, a mirror moment where we can say, there have been moments where I've been the most dangerous animal in this zoo. I've been part of the problem. And so actually asking God to step in and fix it, that might not be the best course of action. Asking him to deal with us in forgiveness, that's what we really need. Great.
Thanks so much. Next question is, wasn't it Christians that came up with the idea that the world is just something that humans get to use and abuse?
Great question. Wasn't it Christians who came up with that idea? Well, I tried to explain in the talk that there are ways in which Christians have been part of the problem, but I think what I'm trying to say is that every time they've been stepping away from real Christianity, stepping away from the Bible and what God's called them to do. And so any attitude that thinks about the world like that is sub-Christian. Do you know the Bible doesn't have a concept of nature, it just thinks about creation. And so nature doesn't exist as this thing, so you've got God and you've got humans, you've got nature. It's God and everything he made, and we're part of everything he made. And that fatal step, which then alienates us from the rest of creation, that's one that people have taken in history. I don't think it's one the Bible encourages us to take. So yes, many Christians have been part of the problem in history. Even at the level of theory, let alone practice, they've been part of the problem. The solution, though, I think, is to let the Bible renew and challenge and refresh us in that, rather than putting it to one side. Because again, like I was trying to say, take God out of the equation, and you are left with a meaningless world, which is just going to end, entropy tells us, in the heat death of everything. How will that help us pursue what is right? What would right even mean in that context?
Thank you. Interesting question here. Faith provides an emotional and mental strength, but how can the church actively participate in change?
A brilliant question. And I think this is one of those ongoing questions where there is no quick answer from me in this moment. The church just needs to get busy and doing it. And creation care should flow from our commitment to God and to following Jesus. There are all sorts of ways that action should come about. I think it would mean thinking about the sustainability of how we act. I think it should mean big questions about where we're investing. So, for instance, the denomination I'm part of, the Church of England, sometimes makes catastrophically unwise investments in things that are just wrecking the planet, and we should be holding them to account in that. So it would mean things that we do as individuals, as small groups, but also very big structural things. Actually, at the chaplaincy next Tuesday, we're going to try and put on an event inviting someone who's a climate activist to help us think about some of the nitty-gritty. You'd be very welcome to that. Ask me about it if you want to know more.
Thanks. Next question is, how do we tackle putting pressure on governments and companies to change, while still being loving and respectful of the authorities they hold?
Great question. And I do think it's fair to say that the Bible does call us in a few areas to submit to the authorities over us, and that is a massive can of worms then. Because sometimes Christians read those passages and think, well, therefore, we just need to go along with what they say. I'm not sure it's that clear-cut. There's a moment where Jesus is challenged about whether he should pay the tax or not. Should you pay the tax to Caesar or not? It's an interesting challenge because actually, if he says, yes, pay the tax, then everyone around him goes, aha, you see, you're colluding with the Romans. But if he says, no, don't pay the tax, then the Romans will say, okay, you're a threat to us and what we're doing, and we'll wipe you out. But what he does is he says, look at the coin. Whose image is on it? And the person says, Caesar. And Jesus says, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and give to God what is God's. And the reason why this is so important is that it recognizes the authority that political entities have. At the same time, though, it raises a bigger question. Because what Jesus is saying when he says, give to God what is God's, is whose image is on you? And I've already said it in the talk, we've been made in God's image. And there are going to be moments where our commitment to bearing God's image means we're going to be challenging the government. But, as I've been trying to say, it doesn't have to come from a place of outright anger. It doesn't have to come from a place of hatred and judgment. It could come from a place of humility and the right kind of anger that wants to see things changed. And I think that's a really important thing for us to pursue.
Brilliant. That's all our questions for the moment. So thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Please do join us for the rest of this week. We have lunchtime and evening talk every day. We'd love to see you there. Tonight's talk is on the theme of identifying my purpose and asking the question, what can make my life worthwhile? So we'd love to see you there. There'll be food and another talk. So thank you for joining us and hopefully see you soon.